The 22nd Amendment could not stop Franklin Roosevelt from becoming President of the United States for 4 times. And why the idea of a third Trump term came up, it went along with the question why Donald Trump cannot do the same thing Franklin Roosevelt did. First of all, to avoid misunderstandings, many people say that Franklin Roosevelt had 3 terms, which is simply not true. Franklin Roosevelt had 4 terms. The source of this misunderstanding is simply that Franklin Roosevelt died shortly after the beginning of his 4th term. Decisive for this video is that the Constitution does not allow to be elected into the office of president more than twice. So how is it possible that Franklin Roosevelt was elected into that office 4 times? When I was very young and new into American history, the first explanation I have ever heard was that it would have been an exception because of World War II. This is not true for 2 reasons. Firstly, in 1940, when FDR was elected for the 3rd time, World War II had already started in Europe, but the US weren't involved yet. Secondly, because the actual reason wouldn't have made it necessary to search for an exception. To get the answer, we simply need to look at the history of the 22nd Amendment. It is also a common misunderstanding that the 22nd Amendment would have been passed by George Washington. It is true that the idea of limited terms goes back to George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, who voluntarily declined being elected for a 3rd time. But firstly, this was something like a code of honor many presidents respected, and Franklin Roosevelt was not the first who ignored that code. He was simply the first who was also elected. But if it is just a code of honor, why can't Donald Trump ignore it as well? After FDR's very long term, the idea came up that it would be better to switch presidents regularly, to have no president for lifetime. Therefore, the Congress brought up the idea of a constitutional change. This is actually quite difficult. At least 3/4 of the states have to agree, 2/3 of the Senate have to agree, 2/3 of the House of Representatives have to agree. The Republican Party was the driving force here. Why did the Republicans care that much about that? Probably because Franklin Roosevelt's popularity, which made him win 4 elections in a row, are the main reason the Republican had only entered the White House with a visitor's pass for 20 years. Of course, some Democrats were necessary to get the 2/3 majority, but yeah, way more Republicans voted for this than Democrats. So the 22nd Amendment came into force in 1951. Since then, no one can become president more than twice. There is one exception, but those circumstances do not fit for Donald Trump anyway. For example, if a vice president, such as Lyndon Johnson, becomes president of the United States by moving up after the actual president had already served for at least 2 years before. LBJ therefore would have been allowed to run for a 3rd term. Still, this never happened. What I still want to say is that the Constitution only says that no one shall be elected into office more than twice. Do with that information whatever you want. Currently, however, I cannot imagine that the Constitution should be changed before 2028, as I told you what is necessary for this. But if you are interested in another constitutional amendment, another time the Constitution was changed, then check out this video here about January 20th. Thank you for watching.